You're standing in the supermarket meat aisle. You pick up a tray of bright red mince and you drop it in the trolley, assuming it was ground fresh this morning. That vivid red color feels like proof of freshness, the same way a green light feels like proof it's safe to cross the road. Except that color isn't always telling you what you think it's telling you. And once you understand what's actually happening between the paddock and that plastic tray, a lot of assumptions about your weekly mince run start to look shaky. Today, we're going through 9 realities behind commercial ground beef that most shoppers never get told, working from the smallest cosmetic trick up to the biggest structural one. Mince is the genuine workhorse of the Australian kitchen. Bolognese, tacos, burger patties, a quick shepherd's pie on a Tuesday night, it's the cut that stretches furthest and asks the least of you. That utility is exactly why it's worth understanding properly. Because a product is central to how households actually eat deserves more scrutiny than the glossy front-of-pack photography usually invites. None of what follows means mince is dangerous, or that you need to swear off it. It means the front label and the reality inside the tray are sometimes telling 2 slightly different stories, and it's worth knowing where those stories diverge. Number 9. Fresh ground beef naturally turns from a purplish red to a duller brown within a day or 2 of being exposed to air, because the myoglobin pigment in the muscle reacts with oxygen and changes color as it ages. A completely normal, harmless process that happens to every piece of red meat on Earth. The trick some packages use is modified atmosphere packaging, sealing meat inside a tray flushed with a specific gas mix, sometimes including a small percentage of carbon monoxide, which binds to myoglobin and locks in a stable, artificially vivid red that can persist well past the point where meat exposed to normal air would have visibly browned. Food regulators in Australia permit this practice, unlike the European Union, which banned carbon monoxide in meat packaging back in 2003, specifically because regulators there decided the stable color it produces can outlast the meat's actual microbial shelf life, meaning the one visual cue shoppers have always relied on, color, stops reliably telling you anything about freshness. It's legal here, but it's worth knowing your eyes are being asked to trust the chemical process rather than nature, and that use-by dates matter more than color once this packaging is involved. Number 8. Fat percentages printed on mince packaging, the classic 95 or 80-20 splits, come from testing standards and industry specifications, but the actual grinding process behind them is closer to industrial batch mixing than precise laboratory chemistry. Large volumes of lean trim and fattier trim get combined in big batches, and while processes are required to meet compositional standards, the practical reality of mixing tons of trimmings from different cattle lots means individual trays can sit at different points within an allowable range. That's part of why a pack labeled as lean can still render a surprising amount of grease in the pan. And it's a big part of why cooked yield, how much actual meat you end up with after cooking, rather than raw weight, is the number that actually reflects what you're paying for. Number 7. Australia is genuinely unusual in global beef terms, because domestic processors overwhelmingly rely on Australian cattle rather than imported trimmings, and Australia exports roughly 70% of the beef it produces, rather than importing meaningful volumes for the domestic mince supply. That's actually the opposite of the sourcing concern that shows up in some other countries' supply chains. And it's worth Australian shoppers knowing that specifically, rather than assuming a concern that applies overseas automatically applies here. Where traceability genuinely does get murkier is at the processing level rather than the border. Cattle from many different properties and even different states can be aggregated at a single large processing facility, which means a tray of supermarket mince can represent dozens of different farms, even though every one of those farms is domestic. Number 6. Mechanically separated or recovered meat, produced by using pressure to strip the last remaining scraps of tissue off bones after primary butchery, is tightly regulated in Australia, specifically because of the historical link between certain recovery techniques and the transmission of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, commonly known as mad cow disease, in the 1990s United Kingdom. Australian food safety standards restrict which tissues can go through mechanical recovery and how the resulting product must be labelled, and Australia has never recorded a locally acquired case of the human variant of that disease, partly because of import controls and strict separation rules introduced in that era. The texture difference some shoppers notice in cheaper mince, A slightly pasty consistency compared to a butcher's hand-cut blend generally comes down to a combination of fat content and how finely the trim was ground, rather than anything approaching that 90s era crisis. It's a good example of a real historical scare shaping today's regulation rather than an ongoing hidden danger. Number 5. Grass-fed is a genuinely meaningful term in Australian beef, but it sits alongside a separate common practice called grain finishing, where cattle spend most of their lives on pasture and then move to a feedlot for a final period, often around 100 to 150 days, to add marbling before slaughter. Some grass-fed labelled products are entirely pasture-raised from birth to slaughter, while the finishing period is where labelling can get genuinely confusing for shoppers, since a product finished on grain for the final months of an animal's life can still carry pasture-heavy branding and imagery. Nutritionally, this matters because time on pasture versus grain shifts the fatty acid profile of the meat. Research comparing grass-finished and grain-finished beef has consistently found grass-finished beef carries a more favorable ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. So if that ratio is specifically what you're paying the premium for, it's worth checking exactly what finishing method a grass-fed label is actually describing, rather than assuming the term guarantees it end-to-end. We're at the halfway point of this list, and this is usually where a countdown like this risks losing you to fatigue. So let's pause on something worth correcting directly. There's a common assumption that every single tray of mince on a supermarket shelf has been individually inspected by a government official before sale. In reality, Australian meat safety relies on a combination of mandatory processor testing programs, statistical sampling protocols, and regulatory audits, rather than an inspector physically examining each tray, because at the scale modern processing operates, 100% individual inspection simply isn't how any food safety system in the world is built. That's not a loophole, it's how large-scale food safety programs function everywhere, built around risk-based sampling rather than exhaustive individual checks, but it's worth understanding rather than assuming a mythical inspector personally cleared your specific tray. Number 4. Feedlot cattle production, like most concentrated animal agriculture, has historically used antibiotics to manage disease risk in densely housed animals, and the World Health Organization has flagged antimicrobial use in agriculture globally as a contributing factor in the broader, genuinely serious problem of antimicrobial resistance. Australia's regulatory settings here are actually comparatively strict. Several antibiotic classes considered critical for human medicine have been restricted or banned from Australian livestock use, specifically to preserve their effectiveness for treating people, and Australia has generally avoided the routine, non-therapeutic growth promotion. Antibiotic use that's drawn criticism in some other major beef-producing countries. That's a genuine point of difference worth knowing. It doesn't mean Australian mince is entirely free of any agricultural antibiotic use, but the regulatory posture here is meaningfully more conservative than the global average. Number 3. Ground meat behaves fundamentally differently to a whole cut like a steak when it comes to bacterial risk. And this is pure food safety, not marketing. On an intact steak, harmful bacteria like E. coli generally live only on the outer surface, which is exactly why searing the outside of a rare steak effectively destroys the risk even if the center stays pink. Grinding a piece of meat takes that same surface bacteria and folds it throughout the entire mass, distributing it into the core rather than leaving it on the exterior. That's precisely why food safety authorities recommend cooking mince all the way through to a safe internal temperature rather than treating a burger patty the way you might treat a rare steak, and it's the single most practical safety fact on this entire list, genuinely worth remembering every time you're deciding how pink to leave that patty. Number 2. Budget chub packs. The tube-shaped, vacuum-sealed formats you'll see at the cheaper end of the mince fridge exist for a straightforward economic reason. That packaging format is cheaper to produce and ship than individual trays, which is exactly why institutional kitchens and value-focused retail lines lean on it. The complete absence of oxygen inside a vacuum tube changes the meat's texture and color compared to tray-packed mince exposed to some airflow, which is why chub format mince can look different and release more liquid in the pan. That's largely a packaging and moisture effect rather than evidence of inherently lower-grade meat, though chub formats do tend to sit at the more basic end of the fat content and trim quality spectrum simply because that's the price point they're built to hit. Number 1. Zoom out from any single tray, and the more interesting question is, Who actually sets the price you're paying at the register? The Australian Competition Consumer Commission's own market study found the country's beef processing sector is dominated by two large players, JBS Australia and Taze Australia, alongside several mid-sized processors, with the five largest processors together accounting for around 54% of total slaughter capacity nationally. That's a genuinely concentrated market structure, though it's a different shape to some other countries. Australian processors are far less vertically integrated into their own feedlot supply than their American counterparts, and the ACCC has run repeated market studies specifically because concentration at the processing level affects both what producers get paid for cattle and what ends up on supermarket shelves. Dozens of different brand names lining a supermarket fridge can absolutely trace back through a genuinely small number of processing groups, which doesn't necessarily mean anything unlawful is happening, but it does mean brand variety on the shelf isn't the same thing as genuine structural competition behind it. So where does that leave you next time you're standing in front of the meat fridge? Not with a reason to panic, but with a sharper set of questions. Check the use-by date rather than trusting color alone, particularly with modified atmosphere packs. Judge fat content by cooked yield rather than the raw percentage on the label. If the fatty acid profile of grass-fed beef is specifically what you're paying for, check the finishing method rather than the imagery. And regardless of price point, cook mince all the way through every single time, because that's the one rule here that's about safety rather than value. Which of these 9 surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments. And if this changed how you shop this week, subscribe, because there's a lot more sitting on supermarket shelves worth a second, more informed look.